Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree. Um, I imagine this is going to be a longer video, so please bear with me. Today we're digging into the 90s, and we're asking the question, was the 90s a good decade? Obviously, I have nostalgia for the 90s. However, I was, to be honest, suicidal throughout most of the decade. Um, spoilers. Spoilers? Trigger warning? Perhaps I'm not. Maybe I'm using the wrong words. Yes, the '90s were a pretty dark decade for me. I got bullied at school. I've talked about this a lot. I did not have a good um, experience outside of school with my social group. Um, they weren't a great decade for me personally, but there were some great things I think that came out of the decades, out of the '90s. Um, there was um, there's this belief that all the world's troubles began after 9/11, and that's just not true. We had school shootings in the 90s. We didn't have mass shootings like every other fucking week like we do today, but they still happened. We still had crime and murder and whatnot in the 90s. Um, we still had wars in the 90s, not necessarily. The US wasn't as directly involved in most military conflicts in the 90s like they are now. I mean, we were involved in like things like Kosovo, and we had operations elsewhere. You know, we had the first Gulf War, um, and we were involved in some other military stuff. But there were military conflicts we stayed out of that some say we probably should have been more involved in. And politically, the 90s were a tumultuous time. Not like they are today, but we were still pretty fucking divisive back then. And politicians, I'm not naming names on both sides, were still playing the whole let's shut down the government to get our way card. That was still happening in the 90s. So, like, in that regard, not much has changed. Not as much has changed as you want to believe, or as people want you to believe. We didn't have the rise of social media yet, and so we didn't have a lot of fringe um, left and right wing extremist, politically leaning media outlets. In the 90s, we had mostly center of the road, CNN and your local news. Um, CNN was more middle of the road then than they are now. Um, I would argue they're more right leaning now than they were in years past, even though they have a reputation of being left leaning. As a leftist, I can tell you they are not as left leaning as people accuse them of being. But I digress. But we had some things in the 90s we don't have today. For one, we had considerable competition in the retail space. We had specialty stores like Sam Goody, Walden Books, KB Toys, Toys R Us, Blockbuster Video, Hollywood Video. We had Electronics Boutique. We had Software, etc. We had Circuit City. All of these names are things that you've probably never been inside. These are stores that are long fucking gone. You know, we had Radio Shack, we had Sears, we had Kmart, you know, we had Shopco. We had fucking King's department store. Remember King's? Do you remember King's? I do. I loved King's. King's was my jam back in the 90s. We had Payless shoe store. We had J.C. Penney, which I think they're still around, but I don't know because I haven't seen one in a while. We had Foot Locker. We had did I already say KB Toys? You know, and then some of them are still around. You know, we had Macy's, I think is still around. We had Sam Goody. No, Sam Goody's gone. We had Spencer's Gifts. I think they're still around. The Buckle. I think they're still around. Cabela's. I think they're still around. But we had a lot more retail competition than we do today. We also had Rite Aid. Remember Rite Aid? They were the Walgreens down the street. You know, the pharmacy that wasn't Walgreens. They were more like a dollar store Walgreens. Yeah, they're gone. We had a lot more local grocery stores back in the 90s too. But we didn't have online retailers. eBay hadn't come out yet. They wouldn't hit the scene until like 98. Um, Amazon and Netflix DVD rentals would come later in the decade. Yahoo and Google would come mid-decade. But even then, people didn't have computers or internet back then either. By and large, most people didn't. There were people who did, but your average American didn't. Or if they did have a computer, they didn't have the internet. And if they did have a computer with the internet, it was dial up, it was CompuServe, it was AOL. You had to subscribe to a service to get on the internet. And you could browse the web if you had like Internet Explorer or Netscape Navigator, but your CompuServe and um, your AOL, etc., they were pretty much your window to the web. Remember AOL keywords? You didn't type in a URL to a website. You didn't go to Sears.com. You just typed in AOL keyword Sears. Did Sears even have an online presence back then? I don't remember. I wasn't online until 2000, which is post 90s, which is when the internet boom really took off. The World Wide Web boom as we know it started in 98. That's when the dot-com bubble began to blow up. So the first like 2/3 of the 90s, the internet was just sort of this thing that was out there you saw on TV or you could maybe get on at the library. But by and large, most people didn't have access to the internet. And even if we did get on the internet, we went to the library or wherever, the school internet or wherever, we were just going to the Yahoo chat room. And we were just copy and pasting ASL 300 times in 300 different chat rooms. ASL, if you don't remember, stands for age, sex, location. It's a creeper thing to do by today's standards, but it was how we interacted. It was like, hey, are you age appropriate for me to talk to? What's your gender, your sex, as we use the term we used back then. So I know if I can hit on you or not, or if we're going to have anything in common. And location was just sort of like, are you close to me or where you at? Can you tell me about, it was a conversation starter. Oh, you live in Florida. What's that like? I live in New Mexico or whatever. So, if anything, you would say the internet as it existed was primitive by today's standards. Internet video didn't really exist. You had Real Player in the later half of the 90s, and you had starting in the 2000s, you got iTunes, but before that, you had QuickTime. So you could download like short web videos. Like I'm talking like 30-second to a minute and a half web videos that were low resolution, grainy. You couldn't really tell what they were supposed to be. And it was just short things like little clips, snippets. Sometimes you would watch trailers on QuickTime, movie trailers. But even that wasn't really a thing yet. There was no YouTube, there was no Facebook or MySpace, there was no Twitter. Social media as a concept didn't even exist yet. We had Usenet groups, and we had GeoCities websites. I had all of my first decade of web development were GeoCities or Lycos. We had Angelfire, things like that. And Yahoo was a search engine before it was anything else. It actually wasn't even a search engine, it was a directory. So you didn't even have Yahoo search. What it was is you had like a page that had categories. So you would click on like books, and then it would sort books by subject. And then you would click on that and find websites that were of that subject. They had to be in the directory. So you didn't even have a search window yet. We didn't even have Google yet. So you couldn't, the term Google, go Google whatever, wasn't even a thing yet. It didn't even exist. We didn't even have a concept for this. And even if you did have web search, which Google was primitive when it launched, it was very primitive for one. There was no AI learning. There was no algorithm. It was just keywords. It would check the metadata on your website, and it would literally just display keywords. So, and it didn't take long for like porn sites and spam sites to figure out that they could spam the keywords and get higher rankings in the Google search, which is why Google had to eventually, develop an algorithm because they had to find a better way of, filtering search results. And then Amazon came on the scene, I believe in 96, which they didn't get big until later. eBay came later. Television was different in the 90s. For one, you know how people talk about satellite TV? They talk about DirecTV and Dish Network. Even those were new in the 90s. Before they came to prominence, we had like smaller companies like Primestar. Do you remember Primestar? We had Primestar. I don't even remember who bought out Primestar or if they went out of business or what happened to them. I don't know. I don't care. They were a thing for like 5 minutes and then they were gone. The 90s was the rise of cable TV. All your cable networks that you know of, aside from a handful of like 20 or so that started in the 70s and 80s, only like 5 or 6 in the 70s. The rest of them started in the 80s and 90s. So like you already had TBS and USA Network and TNT and WGN and CNN in the 80s, HBO, Cinemax, Showtime. Those were in the 80s. But the 90s gave us FX. They gave us Turner Classic Movies, AMC, which used to stand for American Movie Classics, which was just, it was TCM, but with the Fox catalog of movies, the old 20th Century Fox movies. FX was the cable version of the Fox network when it first launched, before it became what it is today. You had A&E, which stood for Arts and Entertainment. You had the History Channel, which was brand new, the Discovery Channel, the Science Channel, the Sci-Fi Channel, which was spelled SCIFI back in the day. You had Cartoon Network, long before we had Boomerang. You had Nickelodeon, but they started in the 70s. Well, they started in the 70s as Pinwheel, and they became Nickelodeon in the 80s, but they rose to prominence in the 90s with Nicktoons. You had MTV, which started in 81. VH1, which started in the mid 80s, those rose to prominence in the 90s. And then mid 90s, you got MTV2 because MTV was moving away from music television, which is what MTV used to stand for. VH1 stood for Viacom Hits 1 before it was just reduced to the 80s network, which is all it is today. You had, you didn't have cable news. You had CNN, but you didn't have any others. CNBC, MSNBC, Fox News, those came later. Those came like towards the end of the decade. So all you had was your local news and CNN. CNN was it for news. You had ESPN. We didn't even have ESPN2 or 3 or any of the others yet. You just had ESPN. There was no NFL network yet. There was no NHL, MLB, whatever. None of those networks existed. NBA, none of those existed. They didn't exist. You watched sports on your local channel, your ABC affiliate, your NBC, CBS affiliate, during primetime television, or you didn't watch sports at all. TNT and TBS slowly started showing sports in the 90s. TBS started with baseball, and TNT started with basketball. And then later they would add more sports programs as time went on. You had TNN, which stood for the Nashville Network in the 90s, which got rebranded as Spike TV in the 2000s. And then I don't even know if Spike TV or whatever it became is still around. I don't know. You had a few other startup cable companies in the 90s. You had the new premium movie channel was Encore, and so you had Encore, which had a host of themed movie channels. You had Encore Action, Encore Love Stories, Encore Mystery, Encore Comedy, etc. And then you had Stars, which started out as like Encore Hits, which was just like their blockbusters, and then it became Stars, and then the Stars family of channels took over. And as far as I know, Encore basically went away. I don't even know if you can still get Encore. I don't even know if they still exist. But Encore had this thing, I don't remember what it was called, but it was a basic cable preview channel, which every day of the week it would show movies from a different Encore network. So one day of the week it would be Encore Mysteries, another day it would be Encore Westerns, etc. So it was like you could get a preview, a taste of what Encore networks offered to entice you to pay extra for the Encore family of channels. And then you got this new thing that came about in the early 90s called first it was the preview channel. Later it got rebranded as the TV Guide channel. I don't even know if that's still around anymore because your cable programs, your cable networks or providers, Comcast, etc., gave you a cable box starting in the 2000s that just had a menu that was reminiscent of what DirecTV and Dish Network had. But before that, you just had to scroll the channels yourself or stop at the preview channel, later the TV Guide channel, and you had this little grid that was a scrolling grid that would just tell you what was on at specific times on each channel. Now, you could also get the TV Guide in the mail, which would tell you what programs were on at a specific time, as well as articles and interviews and things. Or you could buy your local newspaper and get your local TV listings, which would tell you what was happening on your channels in your market. But most of the time, you just had to turn the TV on and just click the button, just flip through the channels. We had a few other upstart cable networks in the 90s that have come and gone. You know, we had Tech TV, which would later become G4, which would disappear, come back, and then disappear again. You had later in the decade, because Cartoon Network um, started to shift its focus. You had the launch of Boomerang, which was basically the Cartoon Network under a new name because the programming that was on the Cartoon Network had shifted. And then you also got the launch of Nick Jr. Um, and then you had things like, did I say the Science Channel? You had the Science Channel. You had TLC, which used to stand for the Learning Channel, but I don't think it does anymore. You had Court TV, which became Bravo, I believe, eventually. And then you had um, the Biography Channel, which was an offshoot of the History Channel and A&E. And then you had like the Military Channel, which I believe was short-lived. And then you had CNN International, which um, was on some cable providers. But then you had CNN Headline News, which was like it was a duplicate of it was basically just CNN again. It was like there was no point to it. And then eventually you had C-SPAN, C-SPAN 2, Bloomberg TV came about after a while. You know, so you started to get all these new cable channels. So it was like for a while you had like a dedicated channel for each thing. So you would have like Game Show Network for game shows, soap opera TV for soap operas. You would have like a channel just for, like the Discovery Channel. You had the History Channel, which was just history programming, etc. And eventually they would all just turn to reality TV, which is all they are today, because that was cheaper to produce. Um, but in the early days, cable networks were just syndicated programs. So they would just like lump together shows from other networks that were in syndication that were themes. So like the Sci-Fi Channel would just lump together sci-fi programs that aired on the networks, ABC, NBC, etc. So you would have Star Trek, you would have reruns of uh, Lost in Space, um, uh, Land of the Lost, Land of the Giants. Um, you would have things like the old reruns of Battlestar Galactica from the 70s. You would have reruns of Sliders. Um, you would have marathons of what's that show called? Um, Quantum Leap, stuff like that. And then you had like the main networks, the cable networks, NBC or not NBC, sorry, TNT, WGN, TBS, and USA Network and WGN, they were all basically just copycats. They were just super stations, basically. They were just like cable TV versions of your local TV channels, um, only without the local news. So they would have like sometimes sports or game shows, but a lot of times it was just syndicated programming. So this was like what television was like in the 90s. Then you had music. So in the 90s, records were fading out. You couldn't go into a record store, as they were still called, a music shop like Sam Goody or whatever, and buy vinyl records. They had been phased out. They had been replaced first by cassette tapes and then later by compact discs. CDs came to prominence in the 80s and were real big in the 90s. So you had like Discman and other copycats. So you had portable CD players and boombox CD players and home CD players. So CD collecting became popular in the 90s. Albums on CD, compact disc, were selling big, massive numbers in the 90s because if you were a teenager in the 90s or in your 20s in the 90s, that was your way of getting music because you could still get music videos on MTV, but they were presentations. So it was like there was a story, there was like, you know, sometimes there were scenes intercut with the music. So it wasn't just the song playing on the video. And then radio stations were basically more or less how they are today, only more localized. They weren't all owned by the same two companies like they are today. So you would have your morning talk show where the DJs would just shoot the shit and then just play random songs. And then you would have your midday, you know, newscast that would also just be like random, like radio hits. And then you would have your drive time songs, which were your more like up tempo songs, and then later you would get into your like request line where it would just be like caller requests, which I don't even know if radio stations still do request lines or not anymore. I don't know because I don't listen to the local radio anymore. Because I got Spotify. Why the fuck would I? I don't need to request a song. I just click on it and there it is. Spotify is my request line, and I'm the DJ now. So music, I've already done videos on music like thematically. You had the rise and fall of grunge. You had the rise of ska. You had the rise of alt rock. You had the rise of um, I'm just gonna say alternative, which is hard to describe. You had stuff like Beck and Weezer and Cake and other bands that really defy category. They're just bands or musicians or whatever. And then you had a lot of um like pop music in the early 90s was driven by R&B and Motown sounds. So you had a lot of like Mariah Carey, Whitney Houston, TLC, uh Boyz II Men, stuff like that. You still had like Paula Abdul, Janet Jackson, uh, there were still carryovers of the 80s. Like you still had New Kids on the Block for a hot minute, stuff like that. But pop had pretty much shifted. It had been more or less replaced with grunge, alternative, uh, dance music, or techno, house, trance, etc. rose to prominence in the 90s. And then hip hop really came on the scene in the 90s. So a lot of your pop acts, your top 40 pop acts, were like Snoop Dogg, Dr. Dre, Criss Cross, House of Pain, MC Hammer, etc. Will Smith, or as he was known at the time, DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince. So you had a lot of like crossover. Now, some pop stations would play hip hop songs. Some of them refused because there were still holdovers of racists running the media, as well as there was the issue of a lot of your rap songs, in particular, especially gangster rap, were thematically inappropriate for radio stations, for the most part, and inappropriate for advertisers. Now, some of them provided what were known as radio edits of their songs. Sometimes they would just cut out the curse words. Sometimes they would re-record the song entirely. And on occasion, you would get to get a different song. Same name, mostly the same lyrics, but changed. But like different music, different, like everything was different. Like you had like specific radio versions for the radio, and then you had club versions for the club, and then you had the album version if you wanted to experience that yourself. So this was the time of remixes were big in the 90s. You had club versions, you had the 12-inch versions, you had the house version of songs, you would have the dance remix, you'd have the, just different versions of songs. So sometimes you would buy albums like Millennium Hip Hop Party, or Now That's What I Call Music, or Club MTV Party to Go, etc. You'd buy these compilations that would give you just different, or jock jams, which I've done a video on, just different like experiences, different versions of songs. You also had Totally Hits, which was a thing for a hot minute and then it went away. So music, access to music was, like I said, you had MTV, VH1, MTV2, you had satellite and cable TV stations. So this was the introduction of like Much Music and More Music, I believe. But then you had like you had the 80s station, the 90s station. You had the alternative station, the dance station, the disco station, the 70s station, the metal station, the rock station, etc., etc., etc. This is where we got it. Music channels came a theme. It would show you like, sometimes it would be album art of the song, kind of like Spotify, but on cable TV. Or it would show you like, notes about the artist, trivia and things like that. Or sometimes it would play the lyrics, whatever. Karaoke machines and karaoke discs were introduced in the 90s. If you had a Sega CD, they could play karaoke discs, CD plus graphics. And we had a phenomenon that was very short lived known as enhanced CD. The way enhanced CD worked is you would get a compact disc that you would put in your radio, your CD player, and it would play audio, just like any other audio CD. But if you put it in your CD-ROM in your computer, enhanced CDs, first of all, would have you install this lightweight proprietary music player, and then you could watch a very grainy, low resolution music video from the album. Some popular enhanced CDs of the time, Backstreet Boys did it, Britney Spears did it. I know Dr. Dre had an enhanced version of The Chronic. There were a few others, big ones. So it was a thing. And another thing you had in the 90s, which I don't know if they still do it or not, because it wouldn't work on Spotify the same as it would on CD, but they had this concept of the hidden track. So the way the hidden track worked is you would have a song play. It would be a 3, 4, 5 minute song, whatever. And then after the song played, there would be dead air for a couple of minutes. Just dead air, nothing. And then after a couple of minutes, another song that wasn't on the track list would just randomly start to play. And the only way to get to that song was through the hidden track. This was a short-lived, I believe, phenomenon. I know Limp Bizkit made use of the hidden track. I think the Beastie Boys also did. There might have been others, but those are the two that I remember doing it. I think Marilyn Manson had some hidden tracks on a couple of his CDs. So it was like a thing people did, you know? And then you also had the rise of music festivals. Now, back in 1969, you had the first major music festival, which was Woodstock. Now, you didn't have a lot of music festivals throughout the 80s. You had concerts. You would go to concerts, big arena rock shows. Or you would go to the local bar and your favorite band would be playing at your local music bar or whatever. But the 90s, we saw the rise of festivals like Lilith Fair, the Tibetan Freedom Concert. You had Lollapalooza, things like that. This was the rise of the alternative scene, gave rise to the what we refer to as the Palooza, or the music festival. This more or less culminated in a um, nightmare rehash of Woodstock in 98, 99. I can't remember when it was. I think it was 99, the 30th anniversary, which was a bullshit thing that really fucking sucked and made headlines for being a disaster because it was a terrible event and a lot of bad things happened at the event. Um, I don't know if festivals, music festivals, are still a thing. I think those have largely been replaced, I think, in our society by conventions, nerd conventions, and things like that. So you maybe music cons or whatever. I don't know because I don't go to cons and I definitely never went to concerts or festivals. Um, Speaking of which, you had the rise of cons. You had a handful of sci-fi cons and things like that in the 70s and 80s. A handful. They were out there. They were mostly small. They were localized to a specific city. They weren't big. Comic Con didn't come on the scene until the 90s. You had the rise of the Consumer Electronics Show, Toy Fair, E3 came on the scene in 95, I believe, was it the first E3? And then you started to get other conventions later. But like the conventions that we know today, PAX, Retropalooza, etc., those came about later. Those were like 2000s on. Those did not exist in the 90s. BotCon had been attempted low key a couple of times in the 90s, but it didn't really become a thing until the 2000s. BotCon is a Transformers convention. Other conventions, like I said, they really came into their thing in the 2000s and the 2010s, which, by the way, a lot of them have gone away, or some of them have gone away. Also in the 90s, because websites weren't a thing yet, they were out there. There were websites out there, but they weren't easily accessible. They weren't prominent, and they weren't like your go-to source. So we still had to rely on magazines in the 90s. So we had a lot of magazines, a lot. Pretty much name a thing or a topic or a people group or whatever. And there was probably like 5 or 6 magazines dedicated to that thing, whatever it was. There were lifestyle magazines, there were toy magazines, video game magazines, computer magazines, comic book magazines, home style magazines, there were home and garden magazines, there were celebrity gossip magazines, teen gossip magazines, news magazines, political commentary magazines, history magazines. There were highlights. Remember highlights? Like kids focused magazines. You had science focused magazines like, um, Popular Mechanics and um, Time Life and stuff like that. So there were like fucking magazines for everything. And comic books were different in the 90s. Now, today, you get comic books from online retailers, Amazon, eBay, etc. You get digital comics through Amazon, Kindle. Used to be Comixology, but we're not talking about that. Or Marvel Unlimited, DC Universe, etc. Or you get them from like Barnes and Noble, or you get them from you can get comic books if you happen to be lucky enough to live in a market that still has a local comic book shop. Those are becoming a thing of the past. Now, in the 90s, you still had comic book shops, but back in the 90s, they were comic book shops. They sold nothing but comic books. They didn't sell Funko Pops, those weren't a thing yet. They didn't sell keychains or statues or action figures or memorabilia because you went to Toys R Us, KB Toys, Kmart, etc. to get those. You didn't get that stuff from your comic book shop. You got comic books from your comic book shop. Trade paperbacks, omnibuses, graphic novels did exist in the 80s and 90s, but they weren't prominent like they are today. Those were a rare thing. When you went to the comic shop, you are flipping through cardboard boxes of floppies, thousands of floppies. You had like a cardboard box dedicated to X-Men. You had one dedicated to Avengers. You had one dedicated to Batman, etc. All the main comics, and then you had the bargain bin, which was just like your 50-cent comics, later 99-cent comics, etc. You had your rack of indie comics. You had your rack of hot new properties. You had your Image comics. You had your Dark Horse comics, etc. Bongo comics. The omnibus, the trade paperback, and the graphic novel, those were novelties. They were not published regularly or consistently like they are today. They did exist, but those were like, you had to go to a bookstore to get those. You didn't get those from your comic book shop. What you got at your comic book shop were individual issues of comic books. They didn't even sell trading cards. You had dedicated yes, trading card shops for trading cards. Or you could get trading cards and comic books at like pawn shops, coin shops, collectible shops, antique stores, etc., thrift stores, whatever. You could also just walk into your local gas station, your local 7-Eleven, your local corner Circle K or whatever, and buy comic books off the rack. And trading cards, they would have packs of trading cards right there at the gas station. I bought trading cards at the swimming pool. They had candies, candy bars, trading cards. Yeah, at the swimming pool. You could buy comic books and trading cards at the grocery store. Sometimes you could get them at the movie theater in the lobby. I mean, they were fucking sold everywhere. It was a different time. Um, the travel center as we know it, the truck stop, really came into prominence in the 90s. Now, truck stops in the 70s didn't really exist. Now, I wasn't there, but I did my homework for a project in college. They were more like on the fringe. It was a gas station out in the middle of nowhere. They weren't really truck stops as we know them. They started to come on the scene in the 80s, but what we refer to today as a travel center. Uh, you got the retail space, you got the showers, you got the restaurant, you got the arcade, you got all that, your big travel center. That came on the scene later. Like in the most of the 90s, your truck stops were basically just gas stations that served big trucks. They might have a cafe, a little diner or something. They might have a game room. They might have a convenience store, maybe a gift shop. That was it. They weren't really full-blown travel centers yet. Now, they did exist. They were starting to come on the scene, but they weren't like commonplace. Like there was no Buc-ee's yet. They didn't really look like they do today. And shopping plazas, as you know them today, didn't exist in the 90s. You had the shopping mall, and then you had retail. You had like Kmart was over here, Walgreens was over there, Goodwill was up the street. They were like just anchors. You didn't have shopping plazas around the stores. You just had the store. That was it. You would have Kmart on one block, and it was just Kmart. There was nothing else on that real estate. It was just Kmart. There was just just Target if there was a Target. Just your grocery store by itself, Albertsons or IGA or Piggly Wiggly or whatever. You didn't have shopping plazas as we know them today. They were starting to come on the scene in the 90s. And they were the hot new thing. They were brand new. We called them strip malls before they became just shorthand to shopping plazas. Um, but today they're on every street corner. It's like every street corner is a shopping plaza. That wasn't the case in the 90s. They were just starting to become a thing. You still had shopping malls, which I just did a video on, which I've already talked about. And a lot of times, if you had a Kmart, it would exist on its own little space. And then across the street from Kmart, you would a lot of times have Walmart, which back then there was no grocery store. Kmart was just a department store. Walmart was just a Kmart with another name on the logo on the front. That's all it was. Kmart and Walmart were indistinguishable back in the day. You couldn't tell which store you were in unless you looked at the sign before you walked in. There was no difference. They both did layaway. Kmart had the blue light special. Walmart had their equivalent of it, which I don't remember what it was called. But they had their little highlight theme, like their specials. So it was like the layouts were identical. You would walk into a Kmart and you could think you were in a Walmart without realizing it. Or you could walk into a Walmart and not know you didn't walk into a Kmart. They were indistinguishable. They were pretty much identical. The same floor plan and everything. They Kmart had red vests, Walmart had blue vests. That was the only difference. You didn't have site to store because there was no websites yet. They didn't have online shopping yet. That didn't exist. You didn't have, curbside pickup. That didn't come about until the pandemic. That's brand new. So you didn't have that yet. And you didn't have grocery stores. And Walmart didn't have the snack food aisle. They didn't have any of that. It was clothes, toys, automotive, sporting goods, home goods, home decor, you had the toy aisle, you had the different clothing aisles, you had the baby section, you had home and garden, you had just you had the book department, which was also where you got your magazines. They didn't even have pharmacies in them yet. They did Walmart's, Kmart's, they didn't have pharmacies in them yet. That came later. You did have they would have their corner optical store, your optical vision. They would sometimes have your hair salon. They would have a photo booth, not a photo booth, but your photo studio, your Olin Mills, go and get your portraits taken, your portrait studio. And they had the electronics department, and within the electronics department, but sort of separate, was the video game department. And still separate from that, but within the same space, was your photography department, where you would go to develop your film, because we didn't have digital cameras yet, and we didn't have 1 hour photo either. It was you would drop it off and pick it up a week later. 1 hour photo came on the scene in the 90s and then just disappeared because we went digital. So 1 hour photo was a short-lived concept, novelty at the time, but quickly replaced by digital. Kodak CDs, video CDs, etc., photo CDs, etc. And then later, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, blah, blah, blah. But that would come much, much fucking later. Hotels were smaller than they are now. They did not have big convention centers by and large. Now, in the cities, they did, but your smaller markets didn't. They were just a hotel. It was just a bed. Sometimes they had a swimming pool. Sometimes they had a laundromat. Sometimes they had a lobby with you know, continental breakfast. They didn't usually have restaurants in them. That didn't come on the scene till later. Um, Motels were scummier back then, I think, than they even are now. Believe it or not. And then you had your convenience stores. Those came on the scene in the late 80s, but really came on the scene in the 90s. Dollar stores came on the scene in the 90s. Those were brand new. They were a novelty at the time. And at the time, they were literal dollar stores. It was like $1 for everything. Um, so they were a lot of crap. They weren't you know, like miniature bargain bin department stores like they are today. It was literally just crap. Um, you know, and they didn't sell food either yet. They would sell potato chips and cookies and snacks, but they didn't have groceries yet. That didn't come till later. Department stores and grocery stores were two different things. It's not like today where you just have the store. Walmart, Target, Albertsons, they're all basically the same goddamn thing. Although your supermarkets came on the scene in the 90s. Um, So you did start to see what we refer to as the supermarket, where you had like the deli, the bakery, the the butcher, etc., all that stuff. Those did exist in the 80s, but they really became a thing in the 90s. Um, but you still had your like local corner grocery stores too, that were just grocery stores. Another store we had back then that we don't really have today, we kind of do, but not like we did back then, was the general store. The general store was like basically what Dollar General is today. That's what the general store was back then. It was just like a hodgepodge of a little bit of everything. It wasn't quite a convenience store. It wasn't a full-blown grocery store. It wasn't even a full department store. It was just a little bit of everything. They would have some t-shirts, some swimming suits if they were by a lake or body of water. Sometimes they would have fishing gear, again, if they were by a lake or water. They'd have like a toy aisle, which would just be like random toys, usually what we refer to today as dollar store toys. But like general stores really didn't last long. They just sort of popped up and then disappeared. They were sort of gobbled up by Dollar General and Family Dollar, which are today those are general stores, but back then we had like dedicated general stores that weren't dollar stores, but they weren't full-blown department stores. Those were short-lived. Those were eventually replaced. And then you had the introduction of things like PetSmart and Office Max and stuff like that. Some of those retailers are still around today, like specialty retailers. Some of those are still around today, but they're different today than they were back then. Back then, they were much smaller and they were way more focused on like PetSmart was just pet food, and you know, it was basically like the pet aisle at Walmart, but in a little bit more space with a little bit more variety. It wasn't like it is today where they've got grooming and everything else. That stuff came later. Because they had to adapt because of the changing landscape, because of the rise of websites like Chewy and Amazon, etc. So again, they had to adapt. So today's stores, your retail stores, are more similar to what general stores and department stores were back in the day, except they also have like groceries and a little bit of everything. So they're like today, obviously, we have more like general stores than we did back then, but they were like bigger. Everything's bigger today. Like Walmarts are ginormous, Targets are gigantic, you know, Cabela's are huge. This wasn't the case back then. We had some big stores. You had, you know, uh, we didn't even have Best Buy yet, but Circus City were pretty big. Best Buy came later. Um, you had Sears, which was pretty big. Now, Sears usually, sometimes you'd get a standalone Sears, but most of the time they were inside your shopping mall. Um, Sometimes, on some occasions, they would be downtown with your Ace Hardware and, your local shops, your downtown shops. But a lot of times, Sears would just be in the shopping mall. Speaking of which, Walmart hadn't become the juggernaut it is today yet. So they weren't the death nail of your downtown yet, like they are now. Back then, you could still have a robust downtown with local shops, customized independent specialty shops that could survive even if Kmart or Walmart came to town. Um, Now, eventually, Walmart's got bigger, Kmart's got bigger, and then Kmart's went away, and then Walmart's replaced them. But as Walmart's got bigger, it became harder and harder for your mom and pop shops to compete. So your local stores started to disappear, your downtown started to dry up. Now, there's been a resurgence of downtowns where there are even more specialty shops like, flavored popcorn stores and yarn shops and like, knickknacks and things like that. Like very hyper specialized retailers, um, even more than they were back in the day. Your trading card shops are gone. By and large, your comic book shops, while your local comic book shop might still be around, it's not a comic book shop anymore. It might still have comic books, but it also has toys and keychains and statues and Funko Pops and all this other stuff. It's not just a comic book shop anymore like it was. Your video game stores aren't around anymore. They have become more general purpose nerd culture stores. Like even GameStop isn't a game store anymore. They've got more toys and action figures and Funko Pops than they do video games. Um, you know, so even that has changed. Um, Record stores are just flat gone. They don't exist anymore. There are no local record stores. Your chains like Sam Goody or Hastings are gone. They're just gone. They don't even exist anymore. There's no remnant of them. They haven't rebranded or anything. They're just they just disappeared. They're the dodo. They're extinct. They're just gone. Um, Toys in the 90s. The 90s were a different time for toys as well. Um, you had in the early 90s, you basically had a continuation of the 80s. You had a cartoon on Saturday morning, you had a comic book in the comic book shops or the magazine racks or whatever, and then you had an action figure line to go along with it. This was still the case in the 90s. And action figures by design, like actual aesthetic and toy, you know, articulation and sculpting, etc., were still pretty much the same as they were in the 80s. You could buy random action figures from the early 90s and random action figures from the mid 80s and not know which decade which toy came out unless you know, because they were pretty much the same. There wasn't a lot of variety like there was in the 2000s. We have less variety now. Well, we have more variety in the specialty adult collector market, like Super 7, you know, McFarlane Toys, NECA and stuff like that. Those didn't exist yet. McFarlane came on in the late 90s. There was no NECA, there was no Funko, there was no Super 7. Um, None of that. That didn't exist. There were no adult collectibles. There were no adult action figure lines. If you were an adult who still collected action figures, you were going to Walmart or Kmart or Toys R Us or KB or wherever and just buying the toys on the shelf, just like everybody else. You know, in the early 90s, action figures were dominated by Ninja Turtles and Ninja Turtle knockoffs like Skeleton Warriors, Bucky O'Hare. You had um, you had Crash Test Dummies. You had Street Sharks, um, and then like Battle Toads and things like that. But it was all basically just like they were more or less just Ninja Turtles, basically just different name, different package, but it was the same toy. It was an anthropomorphized animal with weapons. Sometimes machine guns, sometimes laser swords, whatever. But it was just the same. They were basically just all Ninja Turtles. Your Star Wars toys disappeared. They were gone. He-Man was gone. G.I. Joe was fading away. Ghostbusters was gone by the 90s. Um, you know, He-Man briefly was rebranded as New Adventures of He-Man, and then it disappeared. Um, G.I. Joe fizzled out in the mid 90s, was briefly brought back as G.I. Joe Extreme and then disappeared. Ghostbusters came back as Extreme Ghostbusters and then disappeared. Star Wars came back in the late 90s as Power of the Force, and then it just launched into the special editions and the prequels, episode 1, 2, 3, etc. And then um, like your other stuff, like um, uh, Cops and Crooks, Insectoids, Voltron. Um, what else was there? Inhumanoids, Thundercats, Mask. Those were done. They were all finished. Those toy lines ended. The new toy, like I said, you had Ninja Turtles came on late 80s and dominated the 90s. The new toy that came on in 93 was Power Rangers and other Power Ranger like toys and toy shows like Superhuman Samurai Cyber Squad. You had VR Troopers. You had Kamen Rider or whatever it was called, and then you had what was the other one that was like the Big Bad Beetleborgs? You had those, and then a couple other knockoffs. And then you still had like your big blockbuster movies, your big sci-fi action movies were still getting toys um, at the time. So you were getting Last Action Hero, um, Kevin Costner's Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, Jurassic Park, etc. Like whatever the big blockbuster was, they were still getting toys. Men in Black got toys, Independence Day got toys, Mars Attacks got toys, things like that. So those were still out there, but you didn't have like the adult collector market. Mego was gone, so you didn't have toys based on TV lines. Funko didn't exist yet. There were no Funko Pops yet. You had Tie Beanies. Those were out for a hot minute, and then they went away. You had Gigapets, Nanopets, and Tamagotchis. Those hit the scene, were a flash in the pan, and then went away. You had Tickle Me Elmo, which was a hot flash. And then you had Furby, which was like this new trend of electronic toys in the 90s. And then you had the Tiger handhelds. Those were introduced in the, I think, late 80s, early 90s. And those were big for a hot minute, and then they just were sort of replaced as dedicated handheld game consoles became a thing. Game Boy, Lynx, Game Gear, Nomad, uh, to different degrees of success. Obviously, Game Boy, Game Boy Pocket, Game Boy Color were the big ones, but people still had Lynx and Game Gear and Nomad and Turbo Express. They still had their market. But video games were way different in the 90s. So in the 90s, um, you had a lot more competition. You had a lot more game consoles than we do now. You had 3DO, you had Atari Jaguar, you had Super Nintendo, you had Sega Genesis, Sega CD, Sega 32X, Sega Saturn. Later on, you'd get Dreamcast. You had PlayStation, you had Neo Geo CD, you had CDI, you had Jaguar CD, you had 32X CD, which you had to have a 32X and a Sega CD and a Genesis. You had Virtual Boy for a hot minute. You had the Nintendo 64. You had like the Pippin for a minute. You had the CD32 if you were in Europe or Canada, I think. You had the Laser Interactive. So there were like a lot more video games. So video games, you still had arcades. Video games came out in two places. They were either made for PCs and ported to home consoles, or they were made for arcades and ported to PCs and home consoles. Now, Nintendo and Sega were making dedicated first party titles for their platforms, like dedicated video games for the console. So Nintendo was making, Mario, Mario Kart, Star Fox, Donkey Kong, Kirby, etc. Sega was doing Sonic, Vector Man, Shinobi, etc. So they were both making games for the consoles, but they were also getting a lot of PC ports like Doom, um, and other, I can't think of other PC games at the time, SimCity, etc. And then they were getting arcade ports like Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, Primal Rage, Area 51, um, games like that. So video games in the 90s, video games were divided up into pretty much four categories. You had your 16-bit consoles, you had your 32-bit consoles, you had your CD-ROM consoles, and then you had your multimedia interactive consoles. I know that's a lot. Um, the CDI and the 3DO were your multimedia interactive consoles. Your CD-ROM consoles were Saturn, PlayStation, and Sega CD, to a lesser extent, Neo Geo CD. Your 16-bit consoles were at the tail end of the life of the TurboGrafx 16. You had the Super Nintendo, the Genesis, or Mega Drive elsewhere in the world, Super Famicom in Japan. You still had the CDI, which was a 16-bit CD-ROM system. You had the Neo Geo, which was technically a 16-bit system. And then you had your 32-bit systems like the 32X, and again, your PlayStation, your Saturn, those were 32-bit systems. The 3DO. So video games, a common trend starting in the mid 90s, like 93 on, you had the introduction of virtual reality. Now this was real big in arcades. Virtual reality never really properly came home. What I mean by that is you didn't get a VR headset that would allow you to play VR games as experienced as they were in the arcade, but you were getting home versions of VR. So Star Fox, Doom, Descent, your early 3D games, Virtua Racing, Virtua Fighter, Tekken, Battle Arena Toshinden, stuff like this. This was your VR, but it was for your home console. So it was your 3D gaming as it became known. This got real popular with the PlayStation and Saturn and Nintendo 64 and later Dreamcast. But you also had the rise of multimedia games. So you had the start of this in the 80s. You had Laserdisc games, which did carry over into the 90s, which would carry over to FMV games, mostly on the 3DO and Sega CD, but there were a handful on the PlayStation and Saturn. They fizzled out quickly, very quickly. And then you had the rise of multimedia interactive, story-driven games. You had playable games, 3D or 2D based games, that would have your standard video game gameplay, action adventure games, whatever. But they would have full motion videos or cutscenes, as they're known today, intermixed with the game. So you had Final Fantasy VII, Metal Gear Solid, Resident Evil 2, Tomb Raider, Alone in the Dark, Silent Hill, etc. This was the introduction of story-driven games. Now, prior to this, the most you got from a story from a video game was like still images, cutscenes that would be a graphic with some text, maybe some voiceover if it was on the Sega CD or the TurboGrafx CD. This was still fairly rare. Even rarer, you'd get like video clips, like FMV clips, like Mortal Kombat had some FMV clips with text. NBA Jam had some FMV clips. There were a handful of others, but this was rare. This didn't come through well on the cartridge consoles that were dominant at the time. And then by the time the CD-ROM consoles, Saturn and PlayStation hit the scene, they had pretty much migrated more to an animated cutscene method. Like I said, Final Fantasy VII, Tomb Raider, etc. And then you also had the rise of the JRPG. Now, role-playing games existed in the 80s. They were more popular on the computers than they were home consoles. You had Wizardry, you had Ultima, you had text-based adventure games like Zork. Later on, you'd get Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest or Dragon Warrior in the US. Those would get console ports, most notably the NES, but not a lot. They weren't real big sellers and they weren't real prominent. They weren't like, people weren't buying the NES to play those games. Now, Super Nintendo got a good niche of JRPGs. So you had like Final Fantasy 3 and 2, you had Chrono Trigger, you had Secret of Evermore, you had ActRaiser 1 and 2, etc. You had other games like it. So the Super Nintendo introduced the concept of JRPGs to a home console market, and that market did well. More so in Japan, but it did exist in Europe and in the US. Sega did not embrace the JRPG. There were a handful. There were Phantasy Star games, Shining Force games, Shining in the Darkness, and that was about it. There weren't a lot else. The JRPG really became a thing starting with the PlayStation, with Final Fantasy VII, Legend of Dragoon, Final Fantasy VIII, Final Fantasy IX, um, Final Fantasy, what the fuck was it? Mythic Quest or whatever it was, Mystic Quest or whatever the fuck it was called. Um, and also Final Fantasy Anthology and Chronicles, etc. And then you had JRPG elements seeping into action platformers like Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Mega Man 8 had some of this. Um, your sports simulators were starting to get JRPG elements or RPG elements. Um, and then you had like your big blockbuster adventure games like Ocarina of Time was a big one um, on the Nintendo 64. They had loose JRPG elements that were reminiscent of JRPGs, but not full blown JRPGs. Um, Fighting games came on the scene in the 90s. They didn't exist in the 80s. There were like maybe 4 or 5 kind of proto fighting games in the 80s, like Karate Champ, um, etc. But for the most part, the fighting game as we know it came on the scene in the 90s with Street Fighter 2, Mortal Kombat, Primal Rage, Killer Instinct, World Heroes, King of Fighters, Samurai Showdown, etc. Final Fight, etc. No, Final Fight was more of a beat 'em up. Anyways, and also the beat 'em up really became a big thing in the 90s for a hot minute and then it just sort of faded away. Um, and then you got the 3D fighting games, like I mentioned previously, starting with Virtua Fighter, and then later Battle Arena Toshinden, Tekken. Later you would get Soul Calibur would come about later on, um, and other 3D fighting games of the time. Mortal Kombat 4 was another example, and then you started to get crossover games. There were not a lot of crossover games in the 90s, but they did exist. You had Street Fighter versus X-Men, you had Marvel versus Capcom, you know, you had Double Dragon with Battletoads. So, like the concept of a crossover game was starting in the 90s. This would really kick off um 99 2000 with the introduction of the N64 hit Super Smash Brothers, which is where the idea of a crossover game really took off. Like today, you've got Mario and Sonic at the Olympics, you've got PlayStation All Stars for a hot minute, and again, Smash Brothers is still popular. Mario Kart does some crossover stuff, but crossover games didn't really last long, but they did exist for a hot minute. Um, Video games, PC video games also became a thing in the 90s. Up to 1995, computers were pretty much all over the place. Everybody made their own operating system. You had Commodore, you had Amiga, you had Apple, you had Atari. They were all doing their different things. You know, you had the Falcon, you had the ST, um, all this different random stuff. And then you still had Windows and DOS and IBM, but they were like, just out there. Everything consolidated in 95. Windows 95 introduced the concept of the LCD, the lowest common denominator. This gave us DirectX. Starting with Windows 95, you could make a video game for DirectX, and then your computer just had to be compatible with DirectX. And then later you would get OpenGL, which would come as a DirectX alternative. That would come later. So before that, you had to make a game for Amiga and then port it to Windows and then port it to DOS and port it to Mac and port it to Falcon and port it to Commodore, etc. So like it was a nightmare. And like different models of Amiga, Mac, Windows, etc. had different capabilities. This consolidated with Windows 95. Also, subsequently, or in addition to this, A lot of the the third party players disappeared starting in 95. Some of them were going the way of the dodo before 95. Atari got out of computers. The Falcon family was their last ditched effort. Those were short lived. They were not successful. Apple discontinued the Apple family. Commodore went out of business. Amiga went out of business with them because they were owned by Commodore. You were left with Mac and Windows. Mac was not as successful and was not dedicated to gaming. Video games weren't coming to Mac, just like they pretty much don't today. They were even less back then. Games were pretty much, you were getting to a point where games were made for Windows, specifically DirectX, Windows 95, or DOS, and or they were just made for home consoles, PlayStation, N64, Super Nintendo, Genesis, etc. So, up to that point, PC gaming as a concept in the 80s was weird. Most of your PC games came in two camps. They were either arcade games, just straight ports of arcade games, or they were basically clones or knockoffs, if you will, of console games. You know, you couldn't get Mario or, Donkey Kong or whatever on PC, so you got a Mario type game, a clone, if you will. There was no Mega Man, so you got a game that played like Mega Man or was reminiscent of Mega Man without being a blatant ripoff, copyright infringement. So this was real popular in the 90s. Or I mean the 80s. The 90s you saw the rise of Sims and simulators. You saw the rise of strategy games, real-time strategy games and turn-based strategy games. So you saw stuff like Warcraft, StarCraft, Civilization, other games like it, in that ballpark. You had the Romance of the Three Kingdom games that were coming on the scene. You had Genghis Khan, which those were 80s games, but they had, versions in the 90s. And then you got a lot of Sims, Sim City, Sim Ant, Sim Earth, Sim Theme Park, and then you got the theme park games, or the tycoon games, Roller Coaster Tycoon, etc. And then you started to get the CD-ROM games, which I've already done a whole history of video games. I've done a whole series of videos on it. If you want more in-depth, go look at those. So as a whole, the 90s were nothing like what you're familiar with today. It was like the end of an era. The 90s were the last decade where things looked the last decade that was more or less unfazed by the internet. The internet was coming of age. It was like just brand new. It was a baby. It was in its infancy. The World Wide Web didn't even come about until 1993. So we didn't even have the World Wide Web until the early to mid 90s. So the concept of websites didn't even come on the scene until later in the 90s. Before that, they were just discussion boards, Usenet boards, or BBS's, bulletin boards, or they were like web forums, things like that. They weren't really dedicated websites yet. That came about later in the 90s. We got satellite radio before we got internet radio, before we got Spotify and Pandora. We got real media and QuickTime before we got streaming with YouTube, Netflix, Hulu, and everything else. Those came much later, like starting around 2005, 2006, 2007. So, like mid 2000s. And even game consoles and like DVD players didn't connect to the internet. Game consoles didn't really connect to the internet. They could, but it was optional and you had to buy extra equipment to do it. You had to buy the network adapter. the X-band modem or whatever. So even online gaming didn't really start until the 2000s. The Dreamcast, dabbled in it. The Saturn kind of dabbled in it. But it really started with Xbox and PS2, and then it became a thing starting with 360 and PS3 and the Wii. So even online gaming was not really what it is today when it first started. Now, DVDs. We're talking about DVDs, right? Those didn't even come on the scene until the mid 90s. The first DVD players came about in 96. You didn't really start to see DVD players come down in price until like 99, 2000, 2002 ish, in that ballpark. So, you know, video CD players did exist briefly in the US and Europe, briefly, from 93 to 95, and then they were replaced by DVDs. Laserdisc was still a thing in the 90s. In fact, when people think of Laserdiscs, it's the 90s they think of. The 70s Laserdisc was brand new and very experimental. A lot of your Laserdisc players from the 70s don't work anymore, had stopped working by the 90s. They were faulty. The discs had already suffered to disc rot. So like your Laserdiscs that were pressed in the 70s are gone. The 90s saw the rise of director's cuts and special editions. So, what you think of today, where you buy a movie and it has like audio commentary and deleted scenes and trailers and special features, that started with Laserdisc in the 90s. It was to a lesser extent starting on VHS, kind of. Video CD didn't have the capability of providing special features, so they didn't exist on Video CD. Video CD was very short-lived in the US and Europe. Took off in Asia, in Asian countries like Korea, Japan, China, etc. But even video CDs were not really like major. They never had a major impact. DVD came on the scene. And then HD TVs. HD TVs started in the 90s. But again, your first HD TVs were like 97, 98, and they were plasma screen televisions. They were 32-inch to 37-inch, 720p or 540p televisions. So they weren't even full HD yet. We didn't even have 1080i or 1080p until later. 1080i starting with your CRTs and your rear projection TVs and later DLPs. And then your 720p, 1080p would start in the 2000s to mid 2000s with your LCDs and later LEDs and OLEDs, etc. But in the 90s, you had ED TVs, digital TVs, which were like DVD TVs. They were DVD resolution. They were 480p. Um, they were progressive scan. They were widescreen. They were flat screens, but they weren't high definition. There were high definition TVs in the 90s, but they were ultra expensive. We're talking like $12,000, $20,000 and up. You're not getting an HD TV in 1997, unless you're rich. Because one, they're expensive. Two, they're new technology, which means they're fragile. They don't last long. That there was the whole LCD versus plasma debate because they were not built to last because they were new technology. They were still figuring it out. And three, there was no HD content. Television networks weren't broadcasting in HD. There were no HD cable channels. There were no movies to speak of on HD. DVD was as close as you could get. It was extended definition, or later standard definition, but it wasn't even known as standard definition back then. But yeah, DVD quality, which was digital, you could get progressive scan. But even the DVDs themselves were not encoded in progressive scan. So the players were still deinterlacing them. They weren't native progressive scan. Even your progressive scan players, the discs did not have progressive scan files on them. The MPEG 2 files were encoded as interlaced files. So you wouldn't even start to get HD stuff until like 2000 on. You'd slowly started to get HD channels. You slowly started to get like in 2006 you got HD DVD and Blu-ray. Um, in 2005 and 6 and going forward, you started to get HD like digital downloads from like Xbox and PlayStation. But like HD quality content didn't really become mainstream until like 2009 on. So in the 90s, high definition was pretty much unheard of outside of Japan, where it had been a thing the whole decade of the 80s and 90s. So it was a whole different thing because they were ahead of us back then, technology wise. Um, Cars, I'm not going to spend any more time on this video. Cars in the 90s were going through a shift. We were shifting to more economical cars. So, like muscle cars and big box sedans were fading away. We started to see the rise of minivans and SUVs. And like full sized vans were still a thing, like the Caravan, was still out there. The Plymouth Voyager was still out there. But there was a shift to minivans and smaller compact cars in the 90s. So, to sum it up, let's go back to the question, was the 90s a good decade? The answer to that question is, well, yes, if you were alive then, but no, if you were younger. So, like, if you took a time machine back to 1993 and you were born in like 2006 and you're becoming a teenager and adult today, you would hate the 90s. You would not have nostalgia for the 90s. Computers were primitive, the internet was primitive, cable was still a thing, but even it was kind of primitive. Radio was maturing, just like it was a different time. And not really a good time, to tell you the truth. If you didn't have a dedicated comic book shop or record store, finding records that weren't like your top 40 hits or your like mainstream movie soundtracks were hard. You were pretty much stuck with like what everybody else was listening to. You were buying Britney Spears and, Hootie and the Blowfish because that's all they sold. That you couldn't get, Weezer. They weren't selling, Walmart, Kmart, Target weren't selling Weezer. Or maybe they sold Beck. They sold Odelay, but they didn't sell Mellow Gold because Mellow Gold didn't sell. Maybe you could get Snoop Dogg or Dr. Dre if it wasn't the edited version, if you were lucky. But you were gonna have a much harder time finding RBX or Lady of Rage or the Dog Pound CDs. So you were pretty much stuck with what was mainstream at the time. Even your video stores, your Blockbuster, everybody loves to reminisce about Blockbuster. They didn't have your obscure titles. Blockbuster was notorious for editing movies. One, people forget this. And two, they didn't carry a lot of like the graphic horror movies and sci-fi movies. So like your Trauma films, your Full Moon Pictures. You could get like the mainstream stuff or the more mainstream stuff like, Species or Puppet Master, but you were going to have a much harder time finding stuff at Blockbuster like Night of the Demons or Creeps, or also known as Phenomena, stuff like that. Good luck. You weren't going to find it. 976 Evil is a cult film. You could not rent at Blockbuster. They didn't carry it. I know this because when I wanted to rent 976 Evil, I had to go on a trek to find it. I had to visit like 6 or 7 video stores before I finally found one that rented it. So I don't know why people are so hung up on Blockbuster. They kind of sucked compared to your mom and pop stores. They even sucked compared to Hastings and Hollywood Video. They were not the best place to rent videos. Now, Some places some markets they were the only place to rent video, so you didn't have a choice. But they were never the best. Never were they the best. They were the best for, like, as the name implies, Blockbuster. They were the best for new hits, new titles, big names, big name mainstream stuff. They were not good for obscure stuff. They weren't good for anime. I don't even think Blockbuster rented anime back in the day. I don't even think you could get anime titles. Maybe you could get like Heavy Metal. Maybe you could get Akira or Ghost in the Shell. That was it. You weren't gonna find stuff like Wicked City or Demon City or Project Echo or Ina Musha or Escaflowne. You weren't gonna get that stuff at Blockbuster. Maybe Sailor Moon. Maybe Dragon Ball Z. Maybe if you were lucky. But they weren't like if you wanted anime stuff back in the 90s, which back then I did, you had to go to Sam Goody or Hastings. You weren't going to find it at Hollywood Video. You were not going to find it at Blockbuster. And Blockbuster fucking sucked hardcore balls for horror and sci-fi stuff. You could get like Independence Day. You could get Star Wars. Maybe you could get Star Wars. Probably the special editions. You could get like Jurassic Park if you want to count that as a sci-fi film. But you weren't going to get stuff like Existence at Blockbuster. You weren't going to get Hackers probably at Blockbuster. You maybe could get Lawnmower Man, but you weren't going to get The 13th Floor or Johnny Mnemonic. You definitely weren't going to get, like Robot Jocks. They weren't going to carry that at Blockbuster.